Hi, welcome to the Divorce Allies podcast, a podcast and video series where we dive into all things divorce. We're primarily focused on the process of creating a settlement offer with a team of financial professionals, divorce mortgage planning specialists, parenting coaches, relationship coaches. We cover all the areas of the divorce settlement process from financial to emotional well-being. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I'm our financial mediator and business valuator. And I'm here today with Emile Flowers, who is our divorce mortgage planning specialist. She's got a very long title. And we're kind of going to talk about expert reports and preparing for divorce mediation. And this is a conversation that we have a lot in the Divorce Allies Circle in discussing what are everybody's roles and how do you get prepared for divorce mediation? And really, quite frankly, there are ways that you can get physical reports and actual documentation about some of the things you're going to talk about in mediation. And so just from a framework, I think that, understanding what some of these reports are is kind of a big picture. Even at the beginning, people kind of understand you have to put together a property statement, which is like the list of the things you have, like your house, your cars, and your debts. And then you have your income and expenses, which could be like, what's your income coming in from both of you from your tax returns? So that means you might have to get your tax returns together. Yeah. And those are just the starting points of the financial perspective. But Emile also brings a perspective that we deal with a lot when people are going through like prepping for even a discussion about divorce is, can I keep the house? And for the most part, people are like, well, can I keep the house? Yes, I think I can, or no, I can't. And a lot of discussion happens with the couple about like, well, you can't afford the house, or, I'm going to probably stay with the house because I'm the primary wage earner, and it shuts down the conversation. And if you're in a toxic spouse situation or toxic partner, they could just be telling you, listen, you can't afford it. You're not going to get it. Don't even try. And so it's almost like you remove that option from the table. And is that even necessarily true all the time?
Right. And no, it's not. Like they start in their head and they're like, well, if I have to refinance and my interest rate was 3 and now it's 7, that doubles my mortgage and I won't be able to afford it. Okay. You've made that decision in your head without any fact, any, data gathering, any, guideline knowledge. Everything. You don't know. And there's a million ways to like manipulate, numbers to qualify for a mortgage. You may need a cosigner. Like there's options out there that you haven't thought of. And so these reports that you're talking about and these experts that you bring in that you may or may not know that you need or what they do or how they fit into the picture. Anytime you bring a physical report to a table can be an intimidation factor in itself because you have now gathered some serious data that helps you with confidence come to the table and go, well, I can qualify for a mortgage. I can keep this house. You don't need to know how, but I got a paper that says that I can.
Well, and when you're prepping for divorce mediation, for the most part, everybody does not prep for it. So if your other side is not prepping for it, a way that you can get ahead of the game is to put together some of this documentation. But even if we back up a little bit, you have to start identifying who are you taking advice from, right? So in a highly toxic marriage, typically you are defaulting to what your spouse says. And your spouse says, like, we could afford this or we couldn't afford this. Your spouse could have gotten you into a situation where you couldn't afford and they didn't even discuss it with you. Or you're taking advice from your parents, or you're taking advice from your sisters and brothers, your friends who just got divorced, right? Or everybody thinks that they have had a house and they've gotten a mortgage or they've rented. It's like if you ask somebody if they want to lease or buy a car, everybody has an opinion about what you should do. Oh, you should definitely try to keep the house because then, don't abandon the house. Don't do this, do this. And you can certainly afford it. No, you can't afford it. Like all of it, you have to step back and say, who am I taking the advice from? And if it is a specialized concern, if you have a parenting issue, you should talk to a parenting specialist. If you have a mortgage issue and buying a house, and traditionally, if we don't know if we can afford a house, we just default to the interest rate. Like you said, we default to what we know or what other people are telling us. And when you're prepping for divorce mediation, the fact that you are in a divorce allows you to do certain things, like in the financial world, in your retirement accounts, in exchange, like taking names off of deeds and property. A lot of things are allowed during the divorce because you have a divorce decree in place that says, oh, we're not going to tax you on this disbursement of your IRA because it's for divorce, right?
Yeah. And there's special mortgage guidelines just for divorce that if you're talking to a rando, you may not get the right information. And that's the other scary thing, right? Is you think you're bringing in this expert and they might not be the expert,
Well,
so you have to kind of vet them, right?
Well, and in the house spaces, we would normally call a real estate agent. So like when this conversation happens, I just want to give everybody a preview of the conversation. So typically a financial person, and we could call it a financial neutral and collaborative divorce, but typically I'm hired on one side, okay? Or I could be hired by both people, but let's say for right now, I'm just hired on one side. I come in and we start to put together the property statement, okay? And they say, okay, we have a house. Like that's the first thing that everybody says. And we're like, okay, house. We put the address, do you have a mortgage? Yes. Do you know what the mortgage is? No. Okay. Do you know what it was purchased for? Maybe. Do you think you know the value? Maybe. So we say, well, what, do you know a realtor? Do you know a real estate agent? Why don't you call them and see what they would put the house on the market for? Now, once you call, your friend Sally, who sold you your house and bought your past two houses or whatever the situation is, Sally's going to have a perspective from whatever the value is maybe for the house, and they could maybe give you like a desktop valuation. They could maybe, like you might have to talk to somebody else about an appraisal, but at a minimum,
market research, at that point in time for you.
They'll send you an email and you got this email that is from Sally, the realtor. And Sally says that the value of your house is somewhere between 560 and 600,000.
Yeah.
Now you say to Sally, hey, can I afford to buy this house? If Sally gives you a yes or no answer, it's also going to be based on information that is very subjective or lucrative, like has a lot of different values. So what we're advising for all of our clients is to typically you're going to talk to an expert. If the house is the most important asset, then you need to talk to somebody not only about what the potential value is, what a defendable value is in court, but also if you can afford it. Because quite frankly, you may not want to fight about the value, and we'll talk about the structure of what that looks like in mediation. But let's talk about at the beginning, can I afford it? Talk about, like, this isn't just an email that you send them back and be like, yes, check mark, you can afford it. It's actually a process of an analysis of your income, cash flow, and expenses of the house that culminates in a report that could be used in mediation. So what does that even look like if I don't necessarily know all of the information? Like I'm coming to you and I'm like, I know we have a house. That's about it.
Right. So, and you know, it's funny, like we'll talk about this, but when you're keeping the house, we'll typically get a formalized appraisal, right? And it's a real estate appraisal, but they actually have a general purpose appraisal report that is specifically used in divorce in the courtroom. And then they have another report that is one that I would typically use. And your realtor can provide a formalized document called a CMA. So it's either a comparative market analysis or a competitive market analysis. There are two different ones. They can provide a report. Both the appraisal and the CMA are snippets in time. Okay. Everything's a snippet in time because the minute you change something, the market changes, income changes, this changes, that changes. It kind of blows the whole thing out of the water. When it comes to mortgages are different than real estate. Okay. That is a different professional completely. So once you start talking about mortgages and we start gathering documents and you get a divorce mortgage property report, right? That is taking real information, taxes, W-2s, a credit report so we can prove your liabilities. Gosh, I can't drive this home enough. And then talking about what the potential is. Do you have lump sum assets coming in that we can make into income? Do you have support income that's going to happen? Do we need a co-signer? And you're coming up with all these options to see if we can make one work and you can qualify. Until you've done that process, don't think. Don't like stop and go, oh, I can't. Just get the information. It's all, what do you always say? It's all information. Right. It's information. You're going to gather the information so you can make an educated decision.
Yeah.
And like whether you are comfortable affording something, the house or another house, right? Or rent or whatever the housing may be, is completely different than do you qualify? Mm-hmm. Those are two completely different scenarios. And I would imagine that there's a lot of other professionals involved in this, experts that you could hire that could give you real-time reports that have the same sort of outcomes where it's like, well, you could afford to take this asset and create income with it, but you would, the drawback might be this, or, what have you, in the financial world, or I'm sure there's other examples, but, it's the prep. It's doing the work to get the real information, to get past your thoughts.
Yeah.
And make real decisions.
And let's go back to what mediation is. And so when we're going to divorce mediation, typically we're utilizing this as, we got postponed in the court system. We need to start talking about some of these things. And so people kind of treat mediation as like, well, we'll just go try to figure it out there. Now you go in and it's a he said, she said. So we start, let's just we'll have a conversation about the house, and then we'll kind of move into the business as well. But if we're talking about the house, and so everybody comes in and the first thing that everybody says is like, well, we got a house. The mediator says, who wants it? Right? So if the wage earning spouse comes in and says, well, I want it, like I make all the money, I want to stay in it. They're going to look to the other spouse and say, well, do you want to stay in the house? And if you just sit there and be like, well, yeah, I would like to stay in the house. They're like, can you afford it? And you're like, well, I don't know. Does anybody know what the value is? And the husband's going to say the value is low because he wants to keep the house. That's just the psychology of this. And so now if you come in and you're like, well, I do have a, comparative market analysis that says the house is worth this from this person. And it could just be a 1-page paper. It could be a couple pages. And then I have this mortgage planning analysis that says that I can afford the mortgage, but I'm going to need support payments to be equal to or above $5,000 a month for the next 4 years, the mediator is going to be like, okay, you're prepared. Like, this isn't a he said, she said. It's I got the documents that I needed to support that. Yes, I would like an option in mediation that includes me keeping the house, or an option that includes him keeping the house, because mediation is just a series of options that then you guys decide, the couple decides on what is the best solution to create the best outcome.
Absolutely. You can even come with that going, well, if he took the house and gave me so much money, I would be okay with that and be able to afford another house, or whatever. And that's in my little report too that I have for myself. Think about the difference in how you come to the table just based on that. Based on, hi, I have all this information and I am 1000% prepared with my little, binder. And
because the assumption is going to be, if you don't control the money, if you're not earning the money, if you're the stay-at-home parent, if you are kind of like, they're going to assume that you're in la la land about the money. Yes. If you come in prepared, not only with like, hey, I believe that I can keep the house at the current, like the current price and mortgage, or I could actually, if we can figure out a way that I have, $50,000 or $100,000 down payment from the equity out of the old house, I can actually afford to go buy a $300,000 house, right? And so the fact that you are coming up with a rational and reasonable solution to the problem. The mediator is not there to create necessarily solutions to the problem. They're there to hear both of you, both of your positions, your interest, your desires. Like, they might take a look at the kids. Okay, you got kids that are still young. You still have a parent that's staying home with them. You still have a parent that needs to be picking them up. That house needs to stay in the school district. The other person might be able to live in a smaller situation, like all of those things are taken into account. But the mediator is just saying, well, what would this look like if we sold the house? What would this look like if one of you kept it? So you're creating that the options that you want to be available to you, you're actually providing some documentation that not only confirms that it is possible, but it confirms that you have taken 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps further than the other party. And a lot of times the toxic party is going to just be stalling or trying to make things more difficult. And so, have you, the question then becomes to them, like, have you done the same work? Like, do you have some sort of third party data that says what the house is worth? You don't? Okay, well, the mediator is going to be like, well, we have this one point of data. That's pretty good. Why don't we go from that? And you're literally then anchoring the deal in all of these various positions, but you're anchoring the deal based on an outside party giving you this kind of neutral, unbiased perspective that you can then present. In mediation, you are not bound by what you present. Everything that is in mediation is for settlement purposes only, and is typically protected in the court system, that whatever you discuss in mediation stays in mediation. And so if you're going to come up with creative ideas, it's going to be best to put them into play in mediation, or to have 1 or 2 or 3 options. When you have a toxic individual who is kind of pressing you to make decisions that they want, if you have 1, 2, or 3 options, probably one of your options in there is your favorite, but you don't want to tell them what your favorite one is. You want them to kind of like, to the mediator, like, yes, I'm facilitating options. Let's see what's best for all of the family, including the children. And that's going to be a better way to approach it. The other thing, though, Emily, is that a lot of times I am in the mediation. And so because of my role as more of a financial, either expert or neutral,
Yeah.
I'm actually in the mediation. Like I see what's happening. A lot of times, how is your work done or when is your work done?
I love for it to be done prior to you even, I don't know, thinking about going to mediation or even filing sometimes. It's nice to just have a preliminary look into, is this even possible, right? And I prep clients for mediation all the time, all the time. Because if you don't know kind of what you're talking about when you're presenting this report or this information, it's just sort of like, oh, I have this. I don't really know what the whole thing means. Okay, we don't want to do that either, right? You could have gathered all this information and then you haven't rehearsed it. So you don't exactly know, what that means. Yeah, I want them to come to me as early as possible. Discovery, prior to filing. Sometimes I'm able, like a lot of the times I'll work with both parties, because if one person is giving support, that changes their ability to qualify, and the other person receiving support, that has its own timelines and consistency requirements and things like that we have to abide by. So the sooner we can kind of wrap our brains around, what's able to happen to qualify, because we have to kind of keep it in that realm. In my world, it's all about qualifying. Then the sooner we can start making decisions and come to the table with something reasonable on both sides. So yeah, to me, as soon as possible.
Well, and the reports, I think going through them. So, if you receive a report from an expert, going through it and understanding it is going to be imperative. There are pieces of the report that could be in there that they could use against you or try to manipulate the information to try to explain it in a different way. And so if you understand from a base, reality, and you can speak to it, that's going to be the best thing. In the mediation process, you have to be your own advocate. And that means your own cheerleader, your own investigative reporter, your own, detective, and putting these things, like it may not cost a ton of money to do these pieces, and you can kind of figure it out. The other place that we will normally see this, and obviously is where I get involved, is a business valuation. Yeah. And typically what we're getting into is business valuations that have some sort of property. And so it could be that, you start a business and then you also own the building that you're in. And so a lot of times people are confused of whether they need a business valuation expert, a real estate appraiser, or an equipment appraiser. We had a recent company that called us and they're like, hey, I think we have a building, we have a lot of equipment, and I think we need an appraiser. So do you value buildings and equipment? And I said, well, let me just discuss with you that if the building and the equipment is within an LLC or a business of some capacity, and you own a portion of that business, then you own a portion of a piece of property that can't be divided. So you own an undividable interest in property and equipment. Like you can't cut a forklift in half and one person keeps it and the other person doesn't. But typically the value of those assets, and we usually see it as a return on your assets. So you had to buy those things so that you could have a business that then makes cash flow in the business. And the value of the business is based on the cash flow of that business. Or if it's not operating very well or it's in decline, then the value of the equipment and the building could be more than the value of the cash flow. But what you typically have in a divorce is that somebody needs to come up with what is the value of these pieces. Because again, we go into mediation and we say, what is the value, business owner? And they say, oh, I don't know. We didn't do anything. So you could get a preliminary value to even go into mediation. And because for the most part, if you don't have a value for the business, they're going to want to exchange it for the house. And so the house is worth $600,000. They're going to just be like, I mean, literally, I don't care what the business is. They're going to say that it is equal to the house. That's just going to be a default measure that they do in negotiation. They're like, well, let's just hypothetically say that the business is also worth $600,000. So what did they do? The business owner, by default, has anchored the deal at the same value of the house with no documentation, no understanding, no expert to say anything. And if you come in and you have a preliminary value that says, well, we at least have real estate equipment in here, the minimum value it would be the number in the balance sheet, the equity, but that's typically the minimum value. And what they're doing is trying to exchange a depleting asset, a house that's going to suck money in and maybe not give you the value out, right? Because you're going to put in a pool and, maybe it increases the value or not. And then you have an income generating asset, which is rentable property, equipment that's used into the business. The business itself creates and generates income. And so we're not looking at these two things the same unless they truly are the same. And the odds are they're not going to arbitrarily be the same in any situation.
Right.
Like, you might get lucky if they are.
Well, and we always say, like, your house is a dormant asset, right? It kind of lays dormant until you utilize the equity, right? You sell it, you cash out of it, you whatever. And any money you've put into it is sort of like a forced savings account. Okay. So you're just like, it's just sitting there. But when we're talking about commercial properties and commercial equipment and things like that, you definitely don't want Sally Realtor to be like, oh, I'll go in and do a CMA on that, huge warehouse, because that may not be in their wheelhouse. You really want to dig a little deeper and find somebody who is used to putting values on, there are commercial real estate agents that, only basically do commercial, and they're used to going in and looking at properties to sell, right? And then appraisers have a section, right, where they might have a special person that goes in and just does commercial properties instead of real estate properties. I don't know that for a fact, but I would assume if somebody's used to just doing houses and that's like their thing, they probably bring in somebody maybe a little different to do the commercial properties. Equipment, I'm sure there's a different guy for that, So if I had all the things, I'd be bringing in a professional for each one, an expert, because I wouldn't want to leave that to chance. And I certainly wouldn't want to flip a house for an active business that's going to continue to generate income, whether the appreciation in the market continues to rise or it falls. Because we don't know what that is. I mean, my house didn't appreciate it. We bought it in 2005, right? At the height of the market. It didn't appreciate until like 15 years later. Because that's how the market was. So you just never know.
If you're going into mediation or into divorce in general, the assumption would be the person that has control of the business, control of the assets, control of the rentable property would get a valuation expert to come in and value it. And that's not the case. And so in a lot of times, it may be in your best interest to find your own third party person to come in and provide a value. Now, a real estate appraisal for a commercial building could cost you $3,000 to $5,000. A equipment appraiser who's going to come out and appraise the equipment could cost you another $3,000 to $5,000. The reality is when I come in to value the business, I take their numbers, I put the assets to fair market value. So now that creates a different equity, but I still have to balance it with the cash flow that the assets are creating. And so a lot of times there's some simple analysis that we can do having to do with the rent of the property or the useful life of the equipment that we can make some adjustments. We make some assumptions, and then we develop what a preliminary value of the business is. Now, if you go in with that again, and the person who is the business owner did not do that level of due diligence and preparation, you again are going to be able to position your value as if it is truth because it doesn't have any other thing to go against. And so now you're spending the entire mediation talking about the values that you have brought in for all of these different things, as opposed to the other person is just like, well, I'll reach out to somebody. A lot of times a mediation will end, you only go for 2 hours because, well, we need a house appraisal, we need a building appraisal, we need the business valuation, you need to exchange documents in a very less discovery process so that everybody can have the right documents. And then you agree to get all of the information and come back for a second mediation, which is going to be where you really discuss the issues. So again, if you were prepared for the first mediation, you will win in a lot of capacities because the assumption is going to be that the business owner should know some of this. And the business owner is always going to think their business is worth more than somebody's going to say about it. So they don't have this goal to talk to you about that because they want to get what your position is first. It's like with anybody, if I think something is worth a lot of money, I'm like, well, what would you offer for it? Because I'm going to keep it. And so if I keep the business and we say that it's worth $2 million, I have to provide that $2 million of other assets go to you. That could be a $500,000 house. It could be a $500,000 retirement. It could be $500,000 in cash. It could be $500,000 in other things. Now it starts to make sense that yes, I have different various assets. Whereas over here, like for commercial building, sometimes the rent needs to equal with a cap rate what the value is. Like sometimes a rentable square footage, again, you don't have to go full bore in the mediation to prep for mediation. You need to talk to the right people that have, they're going to maybe say that you need a voc rehabilitation specialist to say how much you can make in the open market if you haven't been in the workforce, right? So it'd be beneficial for you to know, what does that entail? What does that look like? What is that going to, and that would create a report that they would utilize. If you think there's abuse with the children, you can get a psychologist or you can get a report that would say what is happening with the kids. You might need a GAL. All of these types of things would be, you want to uncover them in mediation because those conversations can't leave mediation. If you make an offer in mediation, it's confidential. It cannot be discussed. And I know this firsthand because I go and testify in court and I'll be like, well, in mediation, and they're like, you can't talk about that. You can't discuss that. So it really is a protected environment for you to advocate for yourself, find some of these pieces, and then ask the professional if they can create a report. What does it cost to do that? Do they have a preliminary report? Do they take it in stages? Like we take the business valuation in stages. So we give you a preliminary one that's a lot lower cost than the full one so that you can use it in mediation. If in mediation, you give them the value, we just did this in a case and they said, oh, you think the value is that? Oh, we're going to go get our own expert. Please do, because now you're having, this is an outside discussion of experts. Allow them to have that discussion, not for you to go in and be like, well, I think it's worth this. And that's why I want it. that's not a really good position to go into mediation. Also knowing, like Emily says, what the report actually says. You want it in a very simple form that you can provide to the mediator sometimes before you go to mediation. But if you don't want to disclose your position, you would at least bring copies of it, multiple copies, at least 3 copies to your mediation so that you have it available if you get that far. Sometimes you only get as far as the house or the kids or something like that. But if you have these other documents, you have a better stance in mediation.
Well, and talk about the most bang for your buck, right?
Yeah.
Make the most of your time. Your time is valuable. Make the most of it in any situation, right? And in mediation, if you have to go to court, if you have to hire an attorney, you're hiring them, and then all of a sudden you're asking them questions that technically you could have looked up prior to. You could have done the research for free. You could have figured out what that thing was outside, and then you're not using your time efficiently with that professional. So figure out what the professional needs so you don't have to pay more for that professional, whatever the professional is.
Yeah, more often than not, we are going into mediation also with an attorney or some other advisor, and we default to think that they know what they're doing. And so a key question that you could ask right now to any of your team, if you have lawyers and experts, is how are we going to prep for mediation? And if their answer is, oh, we're just going to figure it out when we get there, we're going to see what they say first, and then we'll know how to respond. I'm telling you, that's not the answer. Even if you don't have all the documents, the answer is to have your own position and to come in and not rely upon your attorney. Because if no one's prepping you for divorce mediation, then they don't know how to. Because in no way, shape, or form should you go into mediation with your own team blind. You should have prepped, like, what are we going to talk about? How are we positioning this up? What documents are we going to give to the mediator before we go into there? If they're not having these discussions, if they're not sitting down and literally prepping with you, they don't know. So you have to get prepped yourself. You need to know what these documents say at a base level. And the most, like, the clearer, simplest version of this analysis is going to be the best, because the mediator is just going to take a big look at it. It's really, how do you take the numbers and put them in a way that's digestible at this like fast pace, right? So it's not giving them a 100-page report because no one's going to read it. It's taking one piece, one page of the 60-page appraisal and giving that to the mediator beforehand, or putting together a property statement and settlement offer beforehand. And each of the numbers that you provided has a 1-page piece of paper that has proof for the value. Again, you're giving that in ahead of time, but your goal should be to go through mediation and divorce mediation and actually have a solution at the end, actually have an agreement that you then take a few weeks afterwards for the lawyers to write up the full details of the agreement. But by the end of that mediation, if you're hyper prepared, the odds are maybe the other side will make a decision and not be prepared. And that is one way that you can have leverage in the negotiation, is that you come hyper prepared, they come unprepared. Toxic people will come unprepared because they just don't want to do the work to get prepared, right? They'll want to bully you and do other tactics.
They'll bulldoze their way through, for sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, well, this was a great discussion, Emily. We're going to also give you some samples of what those reports could look like. So you'll have to look at that within. And then if you join the Divorce Allies, which is really a support group, a group of experts that are answering your questions, all the questions that you may have that you don't want to pay a lot of money to get answered by attorneys or other people that are not necessarily the right advice givers. We bring together on a weekly basis, and you can ask the questions, and we really get into the weeds about the things that you should know in order to come up with this settlement statement. or property statement or settlement offer. And so if that's something that you think you need some additional help with, if you've asked your team, how are they going to prep you for divorce mediation? And they said that we're going to just take our chances. I would encourage you to join the Divorce Allies and get the information that you need in order to make the decisions that are going to be best for you in the mediation. It's like an informed decision process, so do you have the right information to be informed and not relying upon your attorney to do that for you? So it's really an advocating for yourself or being your best cheerleader. Emily, do you want to give any last parting advice as well?
Oh, I can't even think about it. You've covered so much today, but not only gathering your own information, but thinking about what information you don't have from the other side, right? Is there a document that you've been asked to collect that you don't have access to? Making sure you have that list so that request can be made, because you can position yourself as, hey, I'm not making that decision until I have the proof, right? I don't agree. I don't think that these are all your liabilities. I would like a credit report on your side to prove that there's no other debts open in my name, so on and so forth. And, things like that. So I think it's just, going in not only prepared on your side, but also going in and knowing what you're going to need from the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that at a minimum, if you can't get hyper prepared to go into divorce mediation, then you need to prepare a list of documents that you need, that you would like to get. And then the goal of the mediation is to establish a timeline to get those documents and to get them outside of a subpoena. Again, there could be manipulation in the documents, but initially, if you can just get some of the business documents, the business tax returns and things like that, that may not be under your control, you want to have a pretty good list put together, not handwritten. I know that that's what everybody kind of goes through, but print it out. If you want it to be communicated, don't rely upon your team to communicate to the mediator. Don't play the telephone game. Put it in writing, put it in a list, give everybody the list so that they're very clear. Follow up with everybody with the list and say, we've all discussed that we are going to have this documentation shared to everyone by, a month, 3 weeks from now. Here's the date, here's the share file or the uploadable, make it easy for them to give you the information. And then they have all the mediator and the attorneys are all now going to make sure that that happens. And a lot of times with a toxic spouse, we need that kind of group process to make sure that we keep that one person motivated to give the information. So this was great. I appreciate your time, and we will be back next week about more ways that you can be prepared for mediation.